Barren Earned Reward. Magnolia Maggie Tate had a secret crush on her neighbor, Gareth Sullivan, but a rival gang wanted to steal her family's prized gun-making designs. "I won't let them hurt you," she said as she pulled him aside.
"You need to leave town now."
Chapter 1. The Scent of Steel and Longing. The Arizona sun beat down on Magnolia Maggie Tate's back, relentless and unforgiving, as she hammered a glowing piece of steel on the anvil. Sweat beaded on her brow, mingling with the grime that was a permanent fixture of her life at the Tate gunsmithing forge. The scent of coal smoke, hot metal, and oiled leather was as familiar to her as the floral scent of the soaps her mother had once favored, before the desert claimed her. 2. Maggie wasn't a woman built for delicate things, though. Her hands, calloused and strong, were testament to a life spent shaping metal, crafting weapons that were renowned throughout the territory for their precision and deadly beauty. She paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dark smudge across her skin. Her gaze drifted across the dusty yard, past the weathered wooden buildings of their homestead, to the neighboring ranch Sullivan spread. Specifically, her eyes landed on Gareth Sullivan, his silhouette a familiar comfort against the vast, ochre landscape. He was leaning against the corral fence, talking to one of his hands, his broad shoulders shifting as he gestured towards the distant, hazy mountains. Gareth. Just the thought of his name sent a familiar, unwelcome flutter through her chest. Unwelcome because it was a feeling she'd buried deep, a secret longing she'd nurtured in the quiet corners of her heart for years. He was everything she wasn't: settled, grounded, a rancher through and through, with roots that sank deep into this unforgiving land. She, on the other hand, felt like a tumbleweed, forever caught between her family's legacy and a restless yearning for something more. Something she couldn't quite name. He was older, by nearly 10 years, and had always treated her with a kind of avuncular affection that both soothed and frustrated her. He'd ruffled her hair when she was a child, praised her early attempts at gunsmithing with a gentle smile, and offered a steadying hand when grief had threatened to swallow her whole after her father's sudden passing from a rattlesnake bite 3 years prior. He was a constant, a reassuring presence in a world that felt increasingly unstable. And she was hopelessly, secretly, in love with him. The rhythmic clang of her hammer resumed, a steady counterpoint to the erratic beat of her heart. She was working on a custom order, a Colt peacemaker with intricate silver inlays, commissioned by a wealthy rancher from up north. It was meticulous work, demanding her full attention, but her thoughts kept returning to Gareth, to the way his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, crinkled at the corners when he smiled, to the way his voice, a low rumble, could calm her frayed nerves with a single word, to the way he smelled, of leather and horses and the dry, clean scent of the desert wind. A sudden, sharp clang from the workshop next door startled her. Her younger brother, Samuel, emerged, his face flushed with frustration. Samuel, at 22, was all sharp angles and restless energy, a stark contrast to her own more grounded nature. He lacked her patience, her meticulous attention to detail, but he possessed a raw talent for design, a knack for dreaming up innovative mechanisms that pushed the boundaries of gunsmithing. "Damn thing's jammed again," he muttered, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "This new repeater design, it's giving me fits." Maggie set down her hammer, her gaze softening.
"Let me see, Sam."
He held out the partially assembled rifle, a frustrated sigh escaping his lips. Maggie took it, her fingers tracing the lines of the intricate mechanism. She could see the problem immediately: a small burr on the lever, a tiny imperfection that was throwing off the entire cycle. "Here," she said, pointing to the flaw. "You just need to file this down a bit more. Be patient, Sam. These things take time." He grumbled something under his breath, but took the rifle back, his shoulders slumping slightly. She knew he was feeling the pressure. The pressure of their family's legacy, the weight of their reputation. The Tate name was synonymous with quality, with craftsmanship, with weapons that could be relied upon in the most desperate of circumstances. But that reputation had also attracted unwanted attention. A shadow fell across the doorway, and Maggie looked up to see Jedediah Blackwood, the foreman of their small operation, standing there, his face etched with worry. Jedediah was a grizzled veteran, a man of few words and unwavering loyalty. He'd been with her father for years, and he'd stayed on after his death, a steadfast presence in their lives. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "we got trouble." Her heart clenched. She knew that tone. It was the tone he used when danger was near. "What is it, Jed?" "Riders," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Strangers. And I don't like the look of M." He didn't need to say more. She knew. The rumors had been circulating for weeks, whispers of a gang. The Crimson Hawks, notorious for their brutality and their insatiable greed. They'd been terrorizing the territory, robbing ranches, stealing livestock, and leaving a trail of blood and destruction in their wake. And now, it seemed, they'd set their sights on the Tate gunsmithing homestead. On their designs. Her gaze instinctively went to Gareth, still at the corral. The setting sun casts his features in a warm glow.
She wanted to stay.
To tell him how she has felt all these years. "Sam," she said, her voice sharp and urgent, "get the rifles. Jed, lock down the workshop. We need to be ready." She had to protect her family. Her legacy. Even if it meant facing down the devil himself. And a terrible, cold fear twisted in her gut, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. This fear was soon coupled with a burgeoning resolve. She met Jed's worried eyes. "Get Gareth and his men, too. They'll need to be ready. We're sitting on a tinderbox." She turned and headed toward the main house. "I need to talk to him, Jed. Alone." Chapter 2. Shadows in the sun-drenched valley. The interior of the Tate homestead was a study in organized chaos. Rifles hung on the walls, alongside hunting trophies and faded family portraits. The air smelled of gun oil, leather, and the faint, lingering scent of her mother's lavender sachets, tucked away in drawers and chests. Maggie moved through the familiar space with a practiced ease, her mind racing. She needed to find the strongbox, the one where her father had kept the most valuable designs, the ones the Crimson Hawks would be after. She found it hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her father's old study, a heavy, iron-bound chest secured with a complex combination lock. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked the dial, the tumblers clicking softly in the otherwise silent room. The lock sprang open with a satisfying thunk, and she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of velvet lining, were the schematics. Intricate drawings, meticulously rendered in ink and pencil, detailing the inner workings of some of the most advanced firearms in the territory. Designs for repeating rifles, improved revolvers, and even a prototype for a Gatling gun, a weapon that could change the face of warfare. These were more than just drawings, they were the culmination of generations of Tate ingenuity, a legacy worth more than gold. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had to protect these designs, not just for her family, but for the future. If they fell into the wrong hands, the consequences could be devastating. She heard the sound of approaching footsteps and quickly closed the strongbox, replacing the floorboard just as Jedediah entered the room. He looked grim, his weathered face creased with concern. "Gareth's on his way," he said, his voice low. "He brought a few of his men, but I don't know if it'll be enough. The Crimson Hawks, they're ruthless, Maggie. They won't hesitate to kill." "I know," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we won't make it easy for them." A knock on the door, and then Gareth stepped inside. The sight of him, framed in the doorway, sent a jolt of both fear and a strange, unexpected comfort through her. He was taller than she remembered, broader, his presence filling the room. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, were now narrowed with concern, his jaw set in a hard line. "Maggie," he said, his voice a low rumble, "Jed tells me you've got trouble." She nodded, her throat tight. "The Crimson Hawks. They're coming for the designs." His expression darkened. "Damn them. I knew this would happen. Your father's work, it's too valuable, too tempting." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, a gesture of reassurance that sent a shiver down her spine. His fingers were warm and calloused, a stark contrast to the cool smoothness of her skin. "We'll fight them, Maggie," he said, his voice firm. "We'll protect what's yours." She looked up at him, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and a longing she could no longer deny. This was the moment to tell him, to confess the feelings she'd kept hidden for so long. But the words caught in her throat, choked by fear and uncertainty. "Gareth," she began, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you," but before she could finish, a shout from outside shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment. "Writers! They're here." The spell was broken. The time for confessions was over. The time for fighting had begun. Maggie pulled away from him, her hand instinctively reaching for the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall. "We need to go," she said, her voice regaining its strength.
Now.
He nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew. He had to know. The way she looked at him, the way her voice softened when she spoke his name, it couldn't be hidden any longer. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had a fight on their hands. They stepped out into the fading light, the air thick with tension. The Crimson Hawks had arrived. A dozen or more riders, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. They were armed to the teeth, their weapons glinting menacingly in the last rays of the setting sun. The leader, a tall, imposing figure with a cruel scar across his cheek, spurred his horse forward. "We're here for the designs, Tate," he snarled, his voice raspy and cold. "Hand them over, and nobody gets hurt." Maggie stepped forward, her rifle held steady. "You'll have to kill me first," she said, her voice ringing out across the dusty yard. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creaking of leather. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley. The showdown had begun, and in the midst of the gathering darkness, Maggie knew that this night would change everything. It was a strange thought, how a sunset could both signal an end and a beginning. She held Gareth's eyes with hers, finding courage in the concern she found there. The unspoken hung thick between them, but the fight in front of them took precedence. Chapter 3. A whisper of danger, a touch of hope. The standoff stretched, each second an agonizing eternity. The air crackled with tension, the silence punctuated only by the nervous shifting of horses and the low, guttural growl of the Crimson Hawk's leader. Maggie stood her ground, her Winchester trained on the scarred man, her fingers steady on the trigger. Beside her, she could feel Gareth's presence, a solid, reassuring warmth in the gathering gloom. He held his own rifle, a Spencer repeating rifle, with a practiced ease, his eyes scanning the enemy, assessing their numbers, their weapons, their intent. "You're outnumbered, Tate," the leader sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Don't be a fool. Hand over the designs, and we'll leave you in peace." Maggie's grip tightened on her rifle. "We don't negotiate with murderers," she said, her voice cold and hard. The leader let out a harsh laugh. "Murderers? We're just businessmen, Tate, taking what's rightfully ours." "Nothing here is yours," Gareth interjected, his voice a low growl.
This is Tate land, and we protect our own.
The leader's eyes narrowed, focusing on Gareth. "Sullivan, I should have known you'd be mixed up in this. Always the meddling neighbor." "I'm more than a neighbor," Gareth said, his voice laced with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. "I'm a friend, and I won't stand by and watch you threaten Maggie and her family." The leader's gaze flickered back to Maggie, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just cold calculation, in his eyes. "You've got spirit, girl.
I'll give you that.
But spirit won't stop bullets." He raised his hand, a signal to his men. They shifted in their saddles, their weapons raised, ready to fire. Maggie braced herself, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Suddenly, a shot rang out, not from the Crimson Hawks, but from behind them. One of the riders cried out, clutching his arm, his gun clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted. The Crimson Hawks, caught off guard, wheeled their horses, firing wildly in all directions. From the cover of the outbuildings, Samuel and Jedediah, along with Gareth's ranch hands, opened fire. The battle had begun. Maggie ducked behind a water trough, taking cover from the hail of bullets. She fired her Winchester, aiming for the leader, but he was too quick, dodging her shot and disappearing into the swirling dust and gun smoke. Gareth was beside her, reloading his Spencer with a practiced efficiency. "Stay down, Maggie," he shouted over the din of gunfire. "Let us handle this." But she wouldn't. She couldn't. This was her fight, too. She raised her rifle again, firing at a rider who was charging towards them, her shot finding its mark. The rider slumped in his saddle, his horse veering off course. The battle raged on, a chaotic melee of gunfire, shouts, and the screams of horses. Maggie fought with a fierce determination, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to protect everything she held dear. She saw Samuel take down another rider, his face grim and resolute. She saw Jedediah, his old eyes blazing with a warrior's spirit, expertly picking off targets with his trusty Sharps rifle. And she saw Gareth, fighting like a man possessed, his movements fluid and deadly, his aim unerring. He was a force of nature, a protector, a warrior. And in that moment, amidst the chaos and violence, her love for him blossomed, fierce and undeniable. A bullet whizzed past her head, so close she could feel the wind of its passage. She ducked instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. She was exposed, vulnerable. Suddenly, she felt a strong arm around her waist, pulling her back, shielding her from danger. It was Gareth.
"Get down,"
he yelled, his voice hoarse. "You're going to get yourself killed." He pushed her behind the water trough, positioning himself between her and the oncoming fire. He was protecting her, risking his own life to save hers. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of fear, of gratitude, of love. She looked up at him, her heart overflowing. "Gareth," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something deeper, something that mirrored her own feelings. "I know," he said, his voice soft, a whisper in the midst of a storm. "I know, Maggie." And in that moment, amidst the roar of gunfire and the smell of gunpowder, something shifted between them. A silent acknowledgement, an unspoken promise. A spark of hope in the face of overwhelming danger. The battle still raged, but for a brief, fleeting moment, there was only them. He held her close, sheltering her from the continuing fight. They'd deal with the rest later. Chapter 4. The Legacy of Iron and Blood. The gunfire gradually subsided, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the uneasy silence of a battlefield after the storm. The Crimson Hawks, battered and depleted, had retreated, leaving behind a scene of carnage and destruction. Maggie, still shaken but unharmed, emerged from behind the water trough, her rifle still clutched in her hands. Gareth was beside her, his arms still protectively around her waist, his eyes scanning the aftermath. Several of the Crimson Hawks lay dead or wounded in the dusty yard. The Tate homestead, once a picture of quiet industry, was now scarred by bullet holes and the scorch marks of fire. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Samuel and Jedediah, along with Gareth's ranch hands, emerged from their cover, their faces grim and weary. They had survived, but not without losses. One of Gareth's men, a young cowboy named Billy, lay still on the ground, a bullet wound in his chest. Maggie's heart ached at the sight. Billy had been a kind, gentle soul, always ready with a smile and a helping hand. He didn't deserve this. None of them did. Gareth knelt beside Billy's body, his face etched with grief. He closed the young man's eyes, murmuring a silent prayer. Maggie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, sharing his sorrow. "We need to bury him," Gareth said, his voice hoarse. "And tend to the wounded." They worked together, a somber, silent team, tending to the injured, carrying the dead, and beginning the arduous task of cleaning up the mess. Maggie moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands surprisingly steady despite the turmoil in her heart. She had seen death before, but it never got easier. Each loss was a fresh wound, a reminder of the fragility of life in this harsh, unforgiving land. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the valley, they gathered around Billy's grave, a simple wooden cross marking his final resting place. Gareth spoke a few words, his voice choked with emotion, honoring the young man's courage and loyalty. Maggie stood beside him, her hand in his, offering silent support. After the burial, they returned to the homestead, exhausted and emotionally drained. Maggie made coffee, strong and black, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the midst of the devastation. They sat around the kitchen table, a motley crew of survivors, their faces etched with the marks of the night's battle. "They'll be back," Jedediah said, his voice gravelly. "They won't give up that easily. Those designs, they're worth too much." Maggie nodded, her gaze drifting to the study, where the strongbox containing the precious schematics was hidden. She knew Jedediah was right. The Crimson Hawks would return, and they would be even more desperate, more ruthless. "We need to be ready," she said, her voice firm. "We need to fortify the homestead, improve our defenses." Gareth looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "You're strong, Maggie," he said, his voice soft. "Stronger than you know." She met his gaze, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "We all are," she said. "We have to be." Samuel, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "I have an idea," he said, his eyes gleaming with a sudden spark of inspiration. "A way to use the designs to fight back." He explained his plan, a daring, audacious scheme to modify their existing weapons, incorporating some of the advanced features from their father's designs, creating firearms that would give them an edge against the Crimson Hawks. Maggie listened intently, her mind racing. It was a risky plan, but it might just work. It would require all their skills, all their ingenuity, all their courage. But they had nothing to lose. "Let's do it," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "Let's show them what the Tate name really means." They spent the next few days working tirelessly, transforming the workshop into a makeshift arsenal. Maggie and Samuel worked side by side, their hands moving in a synchronized dance, shaping metal, assembling mechanisms, testing and refining their creations. Jedediah and Gareth's remaining ranch hands helped with the heavier work, fortifying the homestead, building barricades, and setting traps. The work was hard, demanding, but it was also therapeutic. It gave them a purpose, a focus, a way to channel their grief and anger into something productive. And as they worked, a new sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose, blossomed amongst them. They were a family, bound together by blood, by loyalty, and by the legacy of iron and blood that flowed through their veins. The legacy now rested squarely on Maggie's shoulders. But the weight of it, surrounded as she was by Gareth and the others, seemed to have lifted. A bit. Chapter 5. Midnight meetings and guarded hearts. The nights were the hardest. The days were filled with the frantic energy of preparation, the clang of hammers, the smell of gun oil, the shared purpose that bound them together. But when darkness fell, the fear crept in, insidious and pervasive. The memory of the attack, the faces of the Crimson Hawks, the sound of gunfire, haunted Maggie's dreams. She found herself drawn to the porch, seeking the solace of the vast, star-studded sky. The desert night was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the heat and chaos of the day. She would sit there for hours, wrapped in a blanket, her gaze fixed on the heavens, searching for some sign, some reassurance, some glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. One night, she found Gareth already there, sitting on the top step, his back against a porch post, his rifle leaning against his shoulder. He looked up as she approached, his eyes, usually so expressive, now shadowed and unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She shook her head, settling down beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Too much on my mind," she said, her voice a whisper. He nodded, understanding. Me too. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The night was alive with sounds, subtle and yet profound, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life went on. I keep thinking about Billy, Maggie said, breaking the silence. He was so young.
He didn't deserve to die.
Gareth's hand reached out, covering hers, his touch warm and reassuring. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's not fair. None of this is. She turned her hand, her fingers intertwining with his, their grip tightening. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a connection, a shared grief, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between them. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
For protecting me.
For being here. He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. I'll always protect you, Maggie, he said, his voice husky. Always. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was more than just a promise of protection, it was a declaration of something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. She looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and fear. She wanted to tell him, to confess her feelings, to lay bare her soul. But the words wouldn't come. The fear of rejection, the fear of disrupting the fragile peace they had found, held her back. She began, her voice trembling. He raised his hand, gently placing a finger on her lips, silencing her. Don't, he said, his voice soft. Not now. Not yet. He understood. He knew what she was going to say, and he was stopping her. Not because he didn't feel the same way, but because the timing was wrong. The danger was too great, the stakes too high. They couldn't afford to be distracted, to be vulnerable. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. He was right. They had to focus on the task at hand, on surviving the coming storm. But the unspoken words, the unacknowledged feelings, lingered between them, a silent promise of something more, something that might blossom once the danger had passed. They sat there for a while longer, their hands still clasped, their shoulders touching, finding comfort in each other's presence. The night was still dark, the threat still real, but in that small, shared moment, they found a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness. A silent vow was made, a decision. They would survive this. Together. The how was still in question, and Maggie's heart still beat with a nervous energy, but the resolution had formed. And that was something. Chapter 6. The Devil's Bargain at Dusk. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The modified weapons were nearing completion, each one a testament to the combined skills of Maggie and Samuel. They had incorporated their father's designs, creating rifles that were faster, more accurate, and more deadly than anything the Crimson Hawks had likely seen. They tested the weapons in the desert, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the vast, empty landscape. Maggie, a natural marksman, found a grim satisfaction in the power and precision of the new rifles. They were tools of survival, instruments of justice, a means of protecting everything she held dear. Gareth, impressed by the modifications, had his ranch hands practicing with the new weapons as well, honing their skills, preparing for the inevitable return of the Crimson Hawks. He was a constant presence at the Tate homestead, his strength and leadership a reassuring anchor in the midst of the storm. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a lone rider approached the homestead. It wasn't one of the Crimson Hawks. It was a man Maggie recognized, a local merchant named Silas, known for his shady dealings and his willingness to trade with anyone, regardless of their reputation. Silas dismounted, his eyes darting nervously around the yard. He was a weasel of a man, with a thin, pinched face and shifty eyes. Maggie didn't trust him, but she knew he might have information they needed. "Miss Tate," he said, his voice unctuous and insincere, "I've come with a proposition." Maggie raised an eyebrow, her hand resting on the butt of her rifle.
"I'm listening."
"The Crimson Hawks," Silas said, his voice low, "they're planning another attack. A bigger one. They're bringing in reinforcements, men from other gangs, mercenaries." Maggie's heart clenched. This was worse than she had feared.
And?
She prompted, her voice cold. And, Silas continued, they're willing to make a deal. They'll leave you alone if you give them the designs. It was the devil's bargain. Surrender their legacy, their future, in exchange for a temporary reprieve. A reprieve that might not even last. They're lying, Gareth said, his voice a low growl. They'll take the designs and kill us anyway. Silas shrugged, his shoulders slumping. Maybe. Maybe not. But it's the only offer you've got. Maggie looked at Gareth, her eyes searching his. She knew what he was thinking. They couldn't trust the Crimson Hawks. They couldn't surrender. Tell them no, she said, her voice firm. Tell them we'll fight. Silas looked surprised, a flicker of fear in his eyes. You're making a mistake, Miss Tate. A big mistake. Get out, Gareth said, his voice menacing. And don't come back. Silas, clearly intimidated, mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Maggie turned to Gareth, her face pale but resolute. We did the right thing, didn't we? He nodded, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, a gesture of reassurance.
We did. We always do what's right.
Even when it's hard. But as she looked out at the darkening landscape, a sense of foreboding washed over her. Silas's words had confirmed her worst fears. The Crimson Hawks were coming back, and they were bringing hell with them. She knew they were running out of time. They had to be ready. They had to be strong. They had to fight, not just for their lives, but for their future. For the legacy of the Tate name. And for the unspoken promise that hung between her and Gareth, a fragile hope that might just survive the coming storm. A storm that would most certainly test the limits of what they could do, and who they were as people. Chapter 7. Echoes of Betrayal in the Canyon. The air grew thick with anticipation, a suffocating tension that settled over the homestead like a shroud. They waited, every nerve on edge, every sense heightened. The nights were filled with the rustling of leaves, the hooting of owls, the distant howls of coyotes, sounds that once seemed peaceful, now seemed ominous, portents of the coming storm. Maggie found herself spending more and more time with Gareth, drawn to his strength, his calm demeanor, his unwavering support. They would talk for hours, sharing stories, dreams, fears. The unspoken feelings between them grew stronger, a silent undercurrent that flowed beneath their every interaction. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge, Gareth turned to her, his eyes serious. Maggie, he said, his voice low, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Her heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment she had been both dreading and longing for. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. I care about you, Maggie. More than I ever thought possible. The words were simple, but they were laden with emotion, with years of unspoken feelings finally brought to the surface. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of a love that had finally found its voice. I care about you too, Gareth, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. So much. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. His touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. I know this isn't the time, he said, his voice husky, but I couldn't wait any longer. I had to tell you. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the moment. I'm glad you did. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a spark, a flame, a promise of something more, something that might just survive the coming storm. But the moment was shattered by a sudden, sharp sound, the snapping of a twig, close by. Gareth pulled away, his hand instantly reaching for his rifle. He scanned the darkness, his eyes narrowed, his senses alert. Someone's out there, he whispered. They moved quickly, silently, taking cover behind the porch railing. Maggie held her own rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette against the dim moonlight. It was Samuel, his face pale and strained. They're here, he said, his voice breathless. The Crimson Hawks. They're coming from the canyon. The canyon. It was a narrow, winding passage, the only way to approach the homestead from the east. It was a natural choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. How many? Gareth asked, his voice sharp. A lot, Samuel said, his voice trembling. More than before. And they've got someone with them. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to Maggie, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. They've got Jedediah, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He's with them.
He's leading them.
Betrayal. The word echoed in Maggie's mind, a cold, sharp knife twisting in her gut. Jedediah, the man who had been like a father to her, the man who had stood by her family for years, a traitor? It couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake. But as she looked at Samuel's face, at the pain and confusion in his eyes, she knew it was true. Jedediah, the man they had trusted, had betrayed them. And the echoes of that betrayal would reverberate through the canyon, through their hearts, through their very souls. The worst part was not knowing why. Chapter 8. The Price of Protection, the Cost of Love. The news of Jedediah's betrayal hit Maggie like a physical blow. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet wound, a wound to the heart, to the soul. She couldn't comprehend it. Jedediah, the man who had been a steadfast presence in her life, a father figure, a loyal friend, a traitor? It was incomprehensible, a nightmare made real. Gareth put a comforting arm around her, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling storm of her emotions. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes, understanding, support, and a shared sense of outrage. We need to move, Gareth said, his voice firm, breaking the stunned silence. The canyon, it's a death trap. We need to find another way to defend the homestead. They quickly gathered their weapons and ammunition, their movements fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to act. Samuel, still reeling from the shock of Jedediah's betrayal, moved like a man in a trance, his eyes glazed with disbelief. I don't understand, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Why would he do this?
Why?
Maggie had no answers. She could only speculate, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the senseless. Had Jedediah been coerced? Threatened? Or had he been a double agent all along, secretly working for the Crimson Hawks? They decided to make their stand at the main house, fortifying the windows and doors, setting up barricades, and preparing for a siege. Gareth, with his experience in ranch defense, took charge, directing their efforts, his calm demeanor a reassuring presence in the midst of the chaos. As they worked, Maggie couldn't shake the image of Jedediah's face, his weathered features, his kind eyes. How could he have betrayed them? The question gnawed at her, a constant, painful reminder of the fragility of trust. She found herself drawn to Gareth, seeking his comfort, his strength. He was her rock, her anchor, the one person she could rely on in this maelstrom of uncertainty. They shared a brief, stolen moment, standing side by side at a window, their rifles at the ready, their eyes scanning the approaching darkness. We'll get through this, Maggie, he said, his voice low, his hand reaching out to touch hers. Together. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had to believe him. She had to believe that they could survive this, that their love, their bond, could withstand the storm. But as the first shots rang out, echoing through the night, she knew that the price of protection, the cost of love, would be high. They were facing not just the Crimson Hawks, but a betrayal from within, a wound that might never fully heal. The battle began, a fierce, brutal exchange of gunfire. Maggie fought with a desperate courage, fueled by anger, by grief, and by a fierce determination to protect her home, her family, her legacy. She saw Gareth fighting beside her, his movements fluid and deadly, his aim unerring. He was a warrior, a protector, a man worthy of her love. But as the night wore on, the odds seemed insurmountable. The Crimson Hawks, bolstered by their reinforcements and guided by Jedediah's knowledge of the homestead's defenses, were relentless. They were pushing closer, their bullets finding their marks, their numbers overwhelming. Maggie knew that they couldn't hold out forever. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and betrayed. But she wouldn't give up. She would fight to the bitter end, defending everything she held dear. For her family, for her legacy, and for the love that had blossomed in the midst of the storm. A love that might just be their salvation. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past, Flames of the Future. The battle raged throughout the night, a relentless onslaught of gunfire and explosions. The Tate homestead, once a haven of peace and industry, was transformed into a war zone, its walls riddled with bullet holes, its windows shattered, its air thick with smoke and the stench of death. Maggie fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, fueled by a primal instinct to survive, to protect. She moved from window to window, firing her modified rifle with deadly accuracy, taking down Crimson Hawks with each shot. Beside her, Gareth fought with equal determination, his Spencer rifle barking out a steady rhythm of defiance. Samuel, despite his initial shock and grief over Jedediah's betrayal, had found his courage. He fought with a reckless abandon, his anger fueling his every move. He was a force to be reckoned with, his modified repeater rifle spitting out a hail of bullets. But despite their valiant efforts, the Crimson Hawks were gaining ground. They were too many, too well-armed, and too familiar with the homestead's layout, thanks to Jedediah's treacherous guidance. Maggie saw one of Gareth's ranch hands go down, a bullet to the chest. She saw another injured, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. The losses were mounting, and her heart ached with each fallen comrade. Suddenly, a fiery explosion rocked the house, sending debris flying and throwing Maggie to the ground. The Crimson Hawks had used dynamite, blasting a hole in the wall, creating a breach in their defenses. Gareth rushed to her side, helping her to her feet, his face streaked with soot and grime, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he shouted over the din of battle. She nodded, her ears ringing, her body shaken but unbroken.
"I'm fine. We need to fall back."
They retreated to the inner rooms of the house, barricading the doors, preparing for a last stand. The situation was desperate. They were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. As they huddled together, waiting for the inevitable onslaught, Maggie looked at Gareth, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and love. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But we're not giving up. We'll fight to the end." He kissed her then, a fierce, desperate kiss, a kiss that spoke of love, of defiance, of a shared commitment to survive. It was a kiss that ignited a spark of hope in the midst of the darkness, a flame that refused to be extinguished. Suddenly, Samuel let out a cry.
"Look."
He was pointing to a small, hidden door in the back of the room, a door that Maggie had almost forgotten about. It led to a secret tunnel, a passage that her father had built years ago, a means of escape in case of emergencies. "It's our only chance," Maggie said, her voice filled with a sudden surge of hope. They quickly gathered their remaining ammunition and supplies, and slipped through the hidden door, entering the dark, narrow tunnel. The echoes of the battle faded behind them, replaced by the silence of the earth, the damp smell of dirt and stone. They were escaping, but they were not defeated. They were wounded, scarred, but their spirit was unbroken. They had lost much, but they still had each other. And they had a future to fight for. A future where the scars of the past would fuel the flames of a new beginning. Chapter 10. A Dance with Deception Under the Desert Moon. The tunnel was dark, damp, and claustrophobic. Maggie led the way, her hand gripping Gareth's, her other hand holding a flickering lantern that cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Samuel followed close behind, his rifle at the ready, his eyes darting nervously around, still shaken by the night's events. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the silence was punctuated only by the drip, drip, drip of water and their own ragged breaths. Maggie could feel the weight of the earth above them, the oppressive darkness pressing in on her, but she pushed forward, driven by a desperate hope, a need to escape, to survive. She had no idea where the tunnel led, only that her father had built it as a last resort, a secret passage that would take them away from the homestead, to safety. She trusted his ingenuity, his foresight, his unwavering love for his family. They walked for what seemed like hours, the tunnel twisting and turning, rising and falling, a labyrinthine path through the heart of the earth. Maggie's legs ached, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to keep going for Gareth, for Samuel, for the future they were fighting for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. Hope surged through Maggie, a renewed sense of determination. They were close. They were going to make it. They emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air, blinking in the sudden brightness of the desert moon. They were in a secluded arroyo, a hidden gully surrounded by towering rock formations, far from the homestead, far from the sounds of battle. They had escaped. They were safe for now. But as they looked around, taking in their surroundings, they realized they weren't alone. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a familiar figure, his face illuminated by the moonlight. It was Jedediah. He stood there, his rifle pointed at them, his eyes cold and hard. He looked older, wearier, his face etched with a mixture of regret and determination. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said, his voice raspy. "But it had to be this way." Maggie stared at him, her heart aching with betrayal, her mind reeling with confusion. "Why, Jed?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you do this?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground. They have my daughter," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "They threatened to kill her if I didn't help them." The Crimson Hawks had used his love for his daughter as leverage, forcing him to betray the family he had served for years. It was a cruel, heartless tactic, but it had worked. Maggie felt a flicker of sympathy for Jedediah, understanding the impossible choice he had faced. But sympathy couldn't erase the betrayal, couldn't undo the damage he had done. "There had to be another way," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "There wasn't," he said, his voice flat. "They would have killed her. I had to protect her." Gareth stepped forward, his rifle raised, his eyes narrowed. "You could have come to us, Jed. We would have helped you." Jedediah shook his head. "You couldn't have. They're too powerful, too ruthless." He raised his rifle, aiming it at Gareth. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice trembling. "But I have to do this." A tense standoff ensued, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the rocks. The moon cast long, eerie shadows, creating a surreal, almost theatrical scene. It was a dance with deception, a tragic ballet played out under the vast, indifferent expanse of the desert sky. The next few moments would determine everything. Chapter 11. The unforgiving truth of twisted trails. The standoff stretched, each second an eternity. Maggie stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She couldn't believe it had come to this. Jedediah, the man she had trusted like a father, pointing a rifle at Gareth, the man she loved. She had to do something, anything, to defuse the situation, to prevent the inevitable bloodshed. But what? She was unarmed, her rifle left behind in the tunnel during their hasty escape. "Jed, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. There has to be another way. We can still help you. We can still save your daughter." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of despair and determination. "It's too late, Maggie. There's no turning back now. I've made my choice." Gareth remained silent, his rifle trained on Jedediah, his eyes cold and hard. He was ready to defend himself, to protect Maggie, but he didn't want to kill Jedediah. He knew the man was acting out of desperation, out of love for his daughter. Suddenly, Samuel, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "You're a coward, Jed," he spat, his voice filled with contempt. "A traitor. You betrayed us. You betrayed my father's memory." Jedediah flinched, his gaze shifting to Samuel, his eyes flickering with a hint of shame. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Samuel retorted, his voice rising. "You could have come to us. We would have helped you. We would have fought for your daughter. But you chose the easy way out. You chose to betray us." Jedediah's resolve seemed to crumble, his shoulders slumping, his grip on his rifle loosening. He looked old, defeated, a broken man. He began, his voice choked with emotion. But before he could finish, a shot rang out, not from Gareth or Samuel, but from behind them. Jedediah cried out, clutching his chest, his rifle clattering to the ground. He crumpled to his knees, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked around, frantically searching for the source of the shot. From the shadows of the rocks, the leader of the Crimson Hawks emerged, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile, a smoking pistol in his hand. "You were a fool, Jedediah," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You thought you could play both sides? You thought you could betray us and get away with it?" He had used Jedediah, manipulated him, and then discarded him like a broken tool. The ruthlessness of the act was chilling. The Crimson Hawks, who had followed them through the tunnel, emerged from their hiding places, their weapons trained on Maggie, Gareth, and Samuel. They were surrounded, trapped, their escape cut short by a cruel twist of fate. The leader of the Crimson Hawks stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Maggie. "The designs," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Hand them over.
Now."
The truth, as unforgiving as the desert sun, had finally revealed itself. Jedediah had been a pawn, a victim, just like them. But his betrayal had led them to this, a desperate standoff with no escape in sight. Chapter 12. Where Loyalty Ends and Love Begins. Maggie stood defiant, her gaze locked with the Crimson Hawk leaders. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She wouldn't surrender. Not now, not ever. "You'll have to kill me first," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. The leader let out a harsh laugh. "Don't tempt me, girl. I've killed plenty of stubborn fools like you." He gestured to his men, and they tightened their circle, their weapons raised, ready to fire. Maggie closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She thought of her father, of her family's legacy, of Gareth. A tear slipped down her cheek, a tear of regret, of sorrow, of love. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a voice filled with defiance and a surprising strength. "You'll have to go through me first." It was Jedediah. He was still alive, though gravely wounded. He had struggled to his knees, his hand clutching his bleeding chest, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. He was making amends. Trying to, at least. The Crimson Hawk leader looked at him, his eyes narrowed with annoyance. "You're a dead man, Jedediah. Stay out of this." "I won't let you hurt them," Jedediah gasped, his voice weak but resolute. He lunged forward, grabbing the leader's leg, trying to pull him down. The leader stumbled, surprised by the sudden attack. It was a moment of chaos, a distraction. And it was all Gareth needed. He reacted instantly, firing his Spencer rifle, his shot finding its mark. The leader of the Crimson Hawks cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol falling to the ground. Samuel, seizing the opportunity, opened fire with his repeater rifle, taking down 2 more of the Crimson Hawks. The tide of the battle had turned. Maggie, spurred into action, grabbed Jedediah's fallen rifle and joined the fight. She fired with a newfound courage, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope. The remaining Crimson Hawks, caught off guard and demoralized by their leader's injury, faltered. They began to retreat, firing wildly as they fled back into the tunnel. Gareth, Samuel, and Maggie pursued them, firing until the last of the Crimson Hawks had disappeared into the darkness. They had won. Against all odds, they had survived. But the victory was bittersweet. Jedediah lay on the ground, his lifeblood staining the sand. Maggie knelt beside him, her heart aching with grief and a strange sense of forgiveness. "Jed," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
"Why?"
He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "I wanted to protect you," he gasped. "I made a mistake." He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallow, his grip on her hand weakening. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And then he was gone. Maggie wept, tears streaming down her face, mourning the loss of the man who had been both a father figure and a betrayer. A man who had ultimately sacrificed himself to save them. Gareth put a comforting arm around her, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling storm of her emotions. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes of understanding, support, and a shared sense of grief. Loyalty had ended. Love was beginning. The lines were blurred, the emotions raw. But in the end, they had each other. And that was all that mattered. Chapter 13. The Weight of Secrets, the Light of Redemption. The aftermath of the battle was somber. They buried Jedediah in the arroyo, a simple wooden cross marking his grave. Maggie stood beside Gareth, her hand in his, offering silent prayers for the man who had been both friend and foe. The weight of his secrets, the burden of his choices, had finally been lifted, leaving behind a legacy of both betrayal and redemption. Samuel stood apart, his face etched with a mixture of grief and anger. He had lost a mentor, a father figure, and the pain of that loss was evident in his eyes. He would need time to heal, to come to terms with Jedediah's actions. They returned to the homestead, a scene of devastation. The house was riddled with bullet holes, the workshop was in ruins, and the air was still thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. But it was still their home, and they would rebuild. They spent the next few days cleaning up the mess, salvaging what they could, and making temporary repairs. The work was hard, demanding, but it was also therapeutic. It gave them a purpose, a focus, a way to channel their grief and anger into something productive. Gareth's ranch hands, those who had survived the battle, helped with the rebuilding efforts. They were a loyal, hard-working crew, and their presence was a comfort to Maggie and Samuel. As they worked, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. The Crimson Hawks had been defeated, their leader wounded, but they hadn't recovered the designs. The strongbox, containing the precious schematics, was still missing. She searched everywhere, turning the homestead upside down, but the strongbox was nowhere to be found. Had the Crimson Hawks taken it with them? Or had Jedediah hidden it somewhere before his death? One evening, as she sat on the porch with Gareth, watching the sunset, she voiced her concerns. "I don't understand," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "Where could it be? The designs, they're our legacy. We can't lose them." Gareth put a comforting arm around her, his eyes filled with understanding. "We'll find them, Maggie," he said, his voice reassuring. "We'll search every inch of this land if we have to." He was right. They couldn't give up. They had to keep searching. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, a fleeting image of Jedediah, standing in the study, near her father's old desk. He had been looking at something, a small, seemingly insignificant object.
A key.
Maggie remembered her father telling her about a secret compartment in his desk, a hidden drawer where he kept his most personal belongings. He had shown it to her once, when she was a child, but she had forgotten all about it. Could it be? Could the strongbox be hidden there? She rushed inside, her heart pounding with a sudden surge of hope. She went to her father's study, to the old, heavy desk that had stood there for years, a silent witness to the family's history. She examined the desk carefully, running her hands along its surface, feeling for any hidden latches or mechanisms. She found nothing. Frustrated, she slumped in her father's old chair, her gaze falling on the desk drawers. She pulled them open one by one, finding nothing but old papers, pens, and inkwells. Then she remembered the key, the small, ornate key that Jedediah had been looking at. She searched her pockets, her memory hazy, trying to recall where she had last seen it. And then she remembered. Jedediah had slipped something into her pocket just before he died. A small, cold object. She reached into her pocket and pulled it out.
It was the key.
Her hands trembled as she inserted the key into a small, almost invisible keyhole on the side of the desk. She turned it and heard a soft click. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing a small, velvet-lined compartment. And there, inside, was the strongbox. Relief washed over her, a wave of gratitude and joy. They had found it. They had recovered their legacy. She lifted the strongbox, its weight a reassuring presence in her hands. She had found more than just the designs. She had found a piece of her father, a connection to her past, a hope for the future. The light of redemption shone brightly, illuminating the darkness of the past, guiding them towards a new beginning. She found Gareth and smiled at him through happy tears. Chapter 14. Crossroads of Fate in the Dust. With the strongbox recovered, a sense of relief settled over the homestead, a fragile peace that replaced the constant tension of the past weeks. The designs were safe, their legacy secured, but the scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, remained. Maggie and Gareth worked side by side, overseeing the rebuilding efforts, their bond strengthened by the shared trauma, the shared victory. They were a team, their individual strengths complementing each other, their love a silent undercurrent that flowed beneath their every interaction. Samuel, however, remained withdrawn, his grief and anger still raw. He spent hours in the workshop, tinkering with the damaged weapons, his movements mechanical, his eyes haunted. He had lost a mentor, a father figure, and the betrayal still cut deep. Maggie tried to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but he pushed her away, his pain a barrier that she couldn't seem to penetrate. She understood. He needed time, space, to process his emotions. One afternoon, as Maggie and Gareth were surveying the damage to the main house, a lone rider approached the homestead. It was a stranger, a man with a weathered face and a wary gaze. He dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I'm looking for Magnolia Tate," he said, his voice gruff. Maggie stepped forward, her own hand instinctively reaching for her rifle.
"I'm Maggie Tate."
The stranger looked her over, his eyes assessing her. "I've heard about you," he said. "About your skills as a gunsmith. About the trouble you've had with the Crimson Hawks." He paused, his gaze shifting to Gareth. "And about your association with Gareth Sullivan." Maggie felt a flicker of unease. Who was this man? And what did he want? "My name is Cole Younger," the stranger said, introducing himself. "I'm a businessman. I deal in opportunities." Maggie had heard of Cole Younger. He was a notorious outlaw, a man known for his ruthlessness and his willingness to cross any line to achieve his goals. "What kind of opportunities?" she asked, her voice cautious. Younger smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The kind that could make you rich. The kind that could make you powerful. The kind that could put the Crimson Hawks out of business for good." He was offering them a partnership, an alliance. He wanted to use their skills, their designs, to his own advantage. It was a tempting offer. Revenge against the Crimson Hawks. Wealth. Power, it was all within their grasp. But it was also a dangerous offer. An alliance with Cole Younger would put them on the wrong side of the law, would make them outlaws, just like him. Maggie looked at Gareth, her eyes searching his. She needed his guidance, his wisdom. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He knew the risks, the potential consequences. "It's your decision, Maggie," he said, his voice low. "I'll stand by you whatever you choose." It was a crossroads of fate, a moment that would define their future. They could choose the path of vengeance, of power, of lawlessness. Or they could choose the path of peace, of rebuilding, of staying true to their values. The dust swirled around them, the wind whispering through the ravaged homestead, the sun beating down on the scarred landscape. The decision weighed heavily on Maggie's shoulders, a burden that she had to bear alone. Or so she thought. She needed to consult Samuel. It was his legacy, too. She asked Younger to give them some time and ushered Samuel and Gareth into the house. The decision was now. Chapter 15. The Gathering Storm of Broken Promises. Inside the partially rebuilt house, Maggie, Gareth, and Samuel huddled together, the weight of Younger's offer pressing down on them. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the creaking of the damaged timbers and the distant sound of hammering. "He's dangerous, Maggie," Gareth said, his voice low, his eyes filled with concern. "An alliance with Cole Younger, it's a path to ruin." Samuel, who had been unusually quiet since Jedediah's death, finally spoke up. "But he could help us," he said, his voice hesitant, his eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and desperation. He could help us get revenge on the Crimson Hawks. He could help us protect ourselves. Maggie understood Samuel's desire for revenge. She felt it too, a burning anger that simmered beneath the surface. But she also knew that revenge was a dangerous path, a path that could consume them, destroy them. "Revenge won't bring back Billy," she said, her voice soft, referring to Gareth's fallen ranch hand. "It won't bring back Jedediah. It won't heal the wounds we've suffered." She looked at Gareth, her eyes pleading for understanding. "We need to think about the future, about rebuilding our lives, about staying true to who we are." Gareth nodded, his hand reaching out to touch hers, a gesture of support. "I agree," he said. "We can't let anger and vengeance consume us. We need to choose the path of peace, of healing." Samuel, however, remained unconvinced. "Peace?" he scoffed, his voice laced with bitterness. "There is no peace in this land. Only the strong survive. And we need to be strong." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "I'm going to talk to Younger," he said. "I'm going to hear him out." Maggie tried to stop him, but he brushed past her, his mind made up. He was determined to pursue his own path, a path that might lead him to darkness. Maggie and Gareth watched him go, their hearts heavy with worry. They knew they couldn't control him, couldn't force him to make the right decision. He was a grown man, and he had to make his own choices. "He's hurting, Maggie," Gareth said, his voice filled with compassion. "He needs time to heal, to find his way." Maggie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew Gareth was right, but it didn't make it any easier. She was afraid for Samuel, afraid of the choices he might make, afraid of the consequences he might face. They waited, their anxiety growing with each passing minute. The sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley. The air grew cooler, the wind picking up, whipping the dust into swirling clouds. A storm was gathering, both literally and figuratively. The broken promises of the past, the uncertain future, the conflicting desires for revenge and peace, it was all coming to a head. Finally, Samuel returned, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told a story. He had made a deal. He had chosen the path of vengeance. Maggie felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She knew that this decision would change everything. It would set them on a collision course with fate, a course that might lead to destruction. The gathering storm had broken, and they were caught in its relentless fury. She looked in Gareth and held his eyes. They both knew there'd be no turning back for any of them now. Chapter 16. A stolen kiss, a shattered trust. The days that followed were filled with a tense unease. Samuel, secretive and withdrawn, spent most of his time with Cole Younger and his men, making plans, preparing for their next move. Maggie and Gareth watched from a distance, their concern growing with each passing day. They tried to talk to Samuel, to reason with him, but he rebuffed their efforts, his mind set on his chosen path. The alliance with Younger had transformed the homestead. It was no longer a place of peace and industry, but a camp of outlaws, bristling with weapons and simmering with a dangerous energy. Maggie felt like a stranger in her own home, surrounded by men she didn't trust, involved in a plan she didn't believe in. Gareth remained by her side, her constant support, her anchor in the swirling storm. Their love had deepened, strengthened by the shared adversity, but it was also tinged with a growing sadness, a sense of impending doom. One evening, as Maggie and Gareth were standing on the porch, watching the sunset, they saw Samuel approaching, accompanied by Younger and two of his men. There was a strange look in Samuel's eyes, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "We're leaving," Samuel said, his voice flat, avoiding Maggie's gaze. "We're going after the Crimson Hawks." Maggie's heart sank. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. "Samuel, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. It's not too late to turn back." He shook his head, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "It is too late," he said. "I've made my choice." He turned to leave, but then hesitated, his gaze finally meeting Maggie's. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of regret, of sadness. I need to show you something, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He led her away from the others, towards the old workshop, his steps hesitant, his demeanor uncertain. Maggie followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Inside the workshop, amidst the debris and the remnants of their past, Samuel stopped. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. I didn't want it to be this way, Maggie, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I wanted to protect you. To protect our family's legacy. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. It was a gesture of affection, of regret, of a love that had been twisted by anger and grief. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't a passionate kiss, a lover's kiss. It was a brother's kiss, a farewell kiss, a kiss filled with a profound sadness. A kiss that spoke of a bond that had been broken, a trust that had been shattered. Maggie stood frozen, stunned by the unexpected gesture. She didn't know what to say, what to do. Samuel pulled away, his eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Maggie, he whispered. For everything. And then, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, joining Younger and his men, riding off towards an uncertain future. Maggie stood there, alone in the ruined workshop, the taste of his kiss lingering on her lips, the weight of his sorrow heavy on her heart. She had lost him. She had lost her brother to the darkness, to the allure of vengeance. A single tear slipped down her cheek, a tear of grief, of regret, of a love that had been tested and broken. She felt Gareth approach and bury his face into her shoulder. He had seen. Chapter 17. Riding towards the reckoning. Maggie watched Samuel ride away with Cole Younger and his gang, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She knew this was a mistake, a dangerous path that would lead to more pain and suffering. But she couldn't stop him. He had made his choice. Gareth stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his presence a silent comfort. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes, understanding, support, and a shared sense of foreboding. We have to do something, Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper. We can't just let him go. Gareth nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. I know. But what? We can't fight them. We're outnumbered, outgunned. They were trapped, caught between their loyalty to Samuel and their desire to avoid further bloodshed. They needed a plan, a way to intervene, to prevent the inevitable disaster. They spent the rest of the night brainstorming, their minds racing, trying to come up with a solution. They considered following Samuel and Younger, trying to talk Samuel out of it, but they knew it was a futile effort. He was too far gone, too consumed by his desire for revenge. They considered alerting the authorities, but they knew that would only lead to more violence, more death. And it would put Samuel in even greater danger. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, Gareth came up with an idea. It was a risky plan, a long shot, but it was their only hope. We need to find the Crimson Hawks first, he said, his voice firm. We need to warn them. Maggie looked at him, surprised. Warn them? But why? They're our enemies. They're Samuel's enemies now, Gareth corrected. And if we can warn them, maybe we can prevent a bloodbath. Maybe we can save Samuel from himself. It was a counterintuitive plan, a desperate gamble. But Maggie knew it was the right thing to do. They couldn't stand by and watch Samuel destroy himself, even if it meant helping their former enemies. They saddled their horses, their movements quick and efficient, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They rode out of the homestead, leaving behind the ruins of their past, riding towards an uncertain future. They rode hard, following the tracks of Samuel and Younger's gang, their eyes scanning the horizon, their senses alert. They knew they were racing against time, that every second counted. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, the sun beating down on them relentlessly, the wind whipping the dust into their faces. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Samuel's life was at stake. As they rode, Maggie couldn't shake the image of Samuel's kiss, the sadness in his eyes, the broken trust that lay between them. She prayed that she wasn't too late, that she could still save him from the darkness that had consumed him. The reckoning was coming, a confrontation that would determine the fate of Samuel, of the Crimson Hawks, and of their own future. They were riding towards it, armed with nothing but their love, their courage, and a desperate hope that they could somehow avert the impending disaster. The air was heavy with expectation. The sky was a canvas of worry. They rode on. Chapter 18. The Heart's Arsenal, the Soul's Surrender. They rode for hours, the landscape blurring into a tapestry of rock, sand, and scrub. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on them with relentless intensity. Maggie's body ached, her throat was parched, but she pushed on, driven by a desperate hope, a need to reach Samuel before it was too late. Gareth rode beside her, his face grim and determined, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was her rock, her strength, the one constant in this chaotic, uncertain world. Finally, in the late afternoon, they spotted them. A cloud of dust in the distance, the telltale sign of riders. It had to be the Crimson Hawks. They slowed their pace, approaching cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. They needed to find a way to warn them, to prevent the ambush that Samuel and Younger were planning. They found a vantage point, a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow canyon, the likely location of the ambush. They dismounted, tethering their horses, and crept closer, their rifles at the ready. From their hidden position, they could see the Crimson Hawks setting up their camp in the canyon below. They were unsuspecting, unaware of the danger that was approaching. "How do we warn them?" Maggie whispered, her voice tense. "We can't just ride down there. They'll shoot us on sight." Gareth thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the canyon, assessing the situation. "We need to create a distraction," he said. "Something that will alert them, give them time to prepare." He looked around, his gaze falling on a pile of dry brush near the edge of the canyon. An idea sparked in his eyes.
"Fire," he said.
"We'll set the brush on fire. The smoke will warn them." It was a risky plan, but it was their only option. They quickly gathered dry leaves and twigs, piling them on top of the brush. Gareth used his flint and steel to strike a spark, and soon, a small flame flickered to life. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the dry brush and the wind. A thick plume of smoke rose into the sky, a visible warning signal. The Crimson Hawks, alerted by the smoke, scrambled to their feet, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the canyon walls. They had been warned. Maggie and Gareth watched from their hiding place, their hearts pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had done what they could. Now it was up to the Crimson Hawks to defend themselves. But as they watched, they saw another group of riders approaching the canyon from the opposite direction. It was Samuel and Cole Younger's gang. The ambush was about to begin. Maggie felt a surge of despair. They had failed. They hadn't been able to prevent the confrontation. But then, something unexpected happened. The Crimson Hawks, instead of engaging Samuel and Younger, began to retreat, disappearing into the maze of canyons and rock formations. They had chosen to avoid the fight. They had heeded the warning. Maggie and Gareth looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and relief. They had succeeded in a way. They had prevented a bloodbath. But where was Samuel? What would happen to him now? The heart's arsenal had been deployed. The soul's surrender had been offered. But the battle was far from over. Chapter 19. Blood on the horizon, love in the ruins. As the Crimson Hawks retreated, a tense silence fell over the canyon. Maggie and Gareth watched, their breath held captive in their chests, waiting to see what Samuel and Younger would do. The outlaw gang, frustrated by their prey's escape, milled around in confusion. Younger, his face contorted with anger, shouted orders, his voice echoing through the canyon. Samuel stood apart, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the empty landscape. Maggie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Samuel would realize the futility of his quest for revenge, would abandon this dangerous path. But her hope was short-lived. Younger, spotting their hiding place on the ridge, let out a roar of rage. "They're up there," he shouted, pointing his pistol at Maggie and Gareth. They warned them.
Get them.
The outlaws, spurred into action, began to scramble up the rocky slope, their weapons drawn, their intentions clear. Maggie and Gareth were trapped. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "We'll fight them," Gareth said, his voice firm, his hand tightening on his rifle. "We'll protect each other." They took cover behind the rocks, firing at the approaching outlaws, their shots echoing through the canyon. It was a desperate, unequal fight. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exposed. Maggie fought with a fierce determination, fueled by adrenaline and a primal instinct to survive. She saw Gareth fighting beside her, his movements fluid and deadly, his aim unerring. He was her protector, her love, her reason to keep fighting. But as the outlaws closed in, Maggie knew that their chances were slim. They were running out of ammunition, their strength waning. Suddenly, a shot rang out, not from their rifles, but from below. One of Younger's men cried out, clutching his leg, his gun falling to the ground. It was Samuel. He was shooting at his own allies. Maggie's heart leaped with a mixture of surprise and hope. Had he finally seen the light? Had he realized the error of his ways? Samuel continued to fire, taking down another outlaw, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was fighting against Younger, against the path he had chosen. Younger, enraged by Samuel's betrayal, turned his pistol on him, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You traitor!" he screamed, his voice filled with fury. But before he could fire, Gareth shot him, his bullet finding its mark. Younger crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. The remaining outlaws, demoralized by their leader's death and Samuel's betrayal, scattered, fleeing back into the canyon. The battle was over. Maggie and Gareth rushed down the slope, reaching Samuel's side. He was unharmed, but his face was pale and strained, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "I couldn't do it, Maggie," he said, his voice trembling. "I couldn't go through with it." Maggie embraced him, tears streaming down her face. She had her brother back. He had chosen the right path at the last possible moment. They stood there, together, in the ruins of the battle, the blood on the horizon a stark reminder of the violence they had witnessed, the love in their hearts a beacon of hope for the future. The storm had passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction, but also a glimmer of redemption. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyon, painting the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple. The air was still, the silence broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind. The battle was over, the dust had settled, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. Maggie, Gareth, and Samuel stood together, a fragile triangle of love, loyalty, and regret. They had survived, but they were scarred, both physically and emotionally. "What do we do now?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes searching Maggie's and Gareth's. He was lost, uncertain, his path forward unclear. He had betrayed his allies, turned against his chosen course, and now he was adrift. Maggie looked at Gareth, her eyes seeking his guidance, his strength. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, but his hand reached out to touch hers, a silent gesture of support. "We go home," Maggie said, her voice firm, her gaze returning to Samuel. "We rebuild. We start over." It was a simple answer, but it was the only answer. They had to return to the homestead, to the place where their roots lay, to the place where they could begin to heal. They began the long ride back, their horses walking slowly, their bodies weary, their minds heavy with the weight of the day's events. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and foreboding, a reflection of their inner turmoil. As they rode, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The Crimson Hawks had been warned, Younger was dead, Samuel had returned to them, but the underlying conflict, the threat to their family's legacy, remained. She remembered the strongbox, the designs, the reason for all the violence and bloodshed. She had almost forgotten about it, caught up in the drama of the battle, the emotional turmoil of Samuel's betrayal and return. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that they needed to destroy the designs. They were too dangerous, too tempting, a constant source of conflict and violence. They needed to let go of the past, to embrace a future free from the burden of their family's legacy. When they reached the homestead, it was dark, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The house, still bearing the scars of the previous attack, stood silhouetted against the starry sky, a symbol of resilience and loss. Maggie dismounted, her legs stiff and sore, her body aching with exhaustion. But her mind was clear, her resolve firm. She went to the study, to the hidden compartment in her father's desk, and retrieved the strongbox. She carried it outside, to the center of the yard, where Gareth and Samuel were waiting. "What are you doing, Maggie?" Gareth asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "I'm ending this," she said, her voice steady, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I'm letting go of the past." She opened the strongbox, revealing the intricate designs, the legacy of generations of Tate gunsmiths. She took them out one by one and placed them on the ground. Then, she took a match from her pocket, struck it, and set the designs on fire. The flames leaped up, consuming the paper, the ink, the legacy. The past was turning to ashes, giving way to a new, uncertain future. Gareth and Samuel watched in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They understood. They supported her decision. As the fire burned, Maggie felt a sense of release, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She was free. They were all free. Gareth put his arm around her, pulling her close, his body warm and comforting. Samuel stepped forward, his eyes filled with a newfound peace. "Thank you, Maggie," he said, his voice soft. "For saving me, for saving us all." They stood there, together, under the vast, star-studded sky, the flames of the past illuminating their faces, their hearts filled with a mixture of grief, relief, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. The final confrontation had taken place, not on a battlefield, but in their hearts, in their souls. And they had emerged, scarred but whole, ready to face the future, together. Epilogue. Years passed. The Tate homestead, once a scene of violence and destruction, was transformed. The bullet holes were patched, the workshop rebuilt, the gardens replanted. Life returned, slowly but surely, bringing with it a sense of peace, of healing, of renewal. Maggie and Gareth were married under the vast Arizona sky, their vows exchanged in the presence of family and friends, their love a beacon of hope in a land that had known too much sorrow. They built a life together, a life rooted in love, loyalty, and a shared commitment to a peaceful future. Samuel, no longer the reckless, angry young man, found his own path. He continued to work as a gunsmith, but his focus shifted. He no longer sought to create weapons of destruction, but tools of protection, firearms that would defend the innocent, not fuel the flames of violence. He found redemption in his craft, using his skills to make amends for the mistakes of his past. The Crimson Hawks were a distant memory, a shadow that lingered in the corners of their minds, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome. The designs were gone, reduced to ashes, their power extinguished. The legacy of the Tate family had been transformed from one of violence and bloodshed to one of peace and craftsmanship. Maggie and Gareth had children, a boy and a girl, who grew up in the warmth of their love, surrounded by the beauty of the Arizona landscape. They learned the values of their parents, the importance of family, of loyalty, of choosing peace over violence. One evening, as Maggie and Gareth sat on the porch, watching the sunset, their children playing in the yard, Maggie felt a deep sense of contentment. They had weathered the storm, overcome the challenges, and emerged stronger, their love a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Gareth reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch warm and familiar. He smiled at her, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "We did it, Maggie," he said, his voice soft. "We built a good life." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had endured. The Arizona sky blazed with color, a breathtaking panorama of orange, red, and purple. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of sage and dust, the sounds of laughter and life. The past was behind them, a tapestry of shadows and light, of loss and redemption. The future was ahead, a vast, open horizon, filled with promise and possibility. And they would face it together, their hearts intertwined, their souls united, their love a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. They turned and faced their growing children. The cries of Mama and Papa rang out, and the smiles on the faces of the elder Tates could not have been brighter. It would be a peaceful night. The end.